She disappeared without a word, no interviews, no tabloids, no goodbye. 20 years later, the truth came out, not in a courtroom, not in a book, but around a fireplace, whispered between a mother and the daughter she once left behind. The cabin was quiet, too quiet for someone like Julia Bennett, once Hollywood's sweetheart, now a recluse whose name was barely mentioned in the industry. For 2 decades she'd lived like a ghost, far from the flashing cameras, the red carpets, the applause. Her legacy? A blurry headline, a few conspiracy theories, and a daughter who refused to speak her name. But tonight, things would change. Outside, the snow pressed against the wooden windows like it was trying to listen. Inside, Julia poured tea with shaking hands, every movement betraying the calm her face tried to hold. Across from her sat Emily, now 24. A woman built from silence, grown from unanswered questions. "You said you'd explain everything." Emily's voice was low, not angry, just tired. No more half-truths, no more excuses. Julia sat. For a long second, she just looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to remember how much time had passed. The actress in her wanted to deliver the line perfectly, but the mother in her had no script. "I didn't leave because I didn't love you," Julia finally said. "I left because if I stayed, you would have grown up inside a lie." Emily didn't speak. Her eyes searched Julia's face for something real, something unpolished. And so Julia began to tell the story, the real story, of her marriage to Nicholas Carter, the billionaire media mogul, and the dark deal she made the night she walked away from everything. Her voice cracked as she revisited that past, the luxury that suffocated, the fame that isolated, the love that twisted itself into control. For the first time in 20 years, her words weren't rehearsed. They were raw, ugly, true. And as Julia spoke, Emily listened. Not as a journalist, not as an audience, but as a daughter reclaiming a missing piece of her own identity. What would be revealed over the next few hours would shatter the official narrative. Julia hadn't been weak, she hadn't been selfish, she had been silenced until now. The fire crackled beside them, like punctuation to each painful memory. Outside, the snowstorm worsened, but inside something long frozen had started to thaw. Because sometimes, the most powerful confessions don't come in front of cameras. They come in whispers, late at night, between two people who have nothing left to lose but the truth. Before the headlines, before the scandal, before the silence, there was warmth. Julia Bennett's life, once upon a time, was golden. The early 2000s marked the peak of her stardom. She wasn't just a name on a poster. She was a presence, elegant, articulate, with a smile that could sell out theaters. Interviews described her as grace in motion. Fans called her America's next Audrey Hepburn. But behind the praise was a woman who cherished the quiet parts of life more than the spotlight. At home, far from the noise of press junkets and premieres, Julia loved simple rituals. Morning coffee in the sunroom, old vinyl records on lazy Sunday mornings, reading poetry aloud to a baby Emily, whose soft giggles were the only applause that truly mattered. And then there was Nicholas Carter, the man she married at the height of her fame. He was a media empire in human form, powerful, poised, untouchable. At first, Julia admired that. He was older, calm, always composed. He didn't chase attention the way actors did. He controlled it. Their wedding was the stuff of tabloid legend, a castle in Scotland, a dress designed by a Parisian icon, and guests worth billions. The media called it a fairy tale. Julia tried to believe that too. In the beginning, Nicholas was attentive in ways that made her feel safe. Dinners by candlelight, handwritten notes, private jets to nowhere, just to watch the stars. Emily was born a year later, and Julia's world seemed, for a brief time, complete. She would spend her days memorizing lines and her nights reading bedtime stories. Her biggest role wasn't on a screen. It was in the nursery, holding her daughter, humming lullabies between filming schedules. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. The staff around the house changed more often. Nicholas became busier, more controlling. He reviewed Julia's scripts before she even read them. He decided which premieres she would attend and which were beneath her brand. At first it felt like protection, later it felt like a cage. Still, Julia tried to hold on to the good. The sound of Emily's footsteps down the hallway, the feel of flour on her fingers from baking cookies, the way Nicholas still kissed her forehead when cameras were watching. She convinced herself the unease was just stress, the pressure of fame, the fatigue of new motherhood. But in the quiet moments, when she caught herself staring into mirrors a little too long, Julia wondered who she was becoming and whether that woman still belonged to herself. And yet, the world only saw perfection. Glowing family portraits, award show appearances, magazine spreads that sold a fantasy. It wasn't all a lie, but the parts that were, they were starting to grow. And Julia, she was beginning to disappear. The day everything changed wasn't loud. It didn't explode like a scandal. It whispered. Julia had just wrapped filming for a romantic drama in Italy, one of the few projects Nicholas had approved. She returned home early, surprising even the staff. Emily was 6. She had started drawing little pictures of their family, always Julia, Emily, and Daddy. Smiling stick figures in crayon, but that afternoon the house felt colder, quieter. Julia found Emily in her room with a nanny she didn't recognize. The woman avoided Julia's eyes. There was tension in the way she stood, rehearsed, mechanical. Julia asked where Nicholas was. "He's in his study," the nanny said quickly. Julia walked down the hall, her heels barely making a sound on the marble floor. She paused at the door, already sensing something wasn't right. Her hand hovered over the knob, but the door opened before she could knock. Nicholas stood there, startled. Behind him, a young woman, his assistant, gathered her things, flustered and red-faced. She wouldn't meet Julia's eyes. The air was thick with unspoken things. "Is there something you'd like to tell me?" Julia asked, her voice calm, almost detached. Nicholas didn't deny it. He didn't even apologize. He just looked at her, tired, cold, and said, "This is how things are now. Don't make it harder than it needs to be." That moment shattered something in her. It wasn't the betrayal itself. Julia had lived long enough in celebrity circles to know affairs were almost expected. It was the way he said it, as if she were a business inconvenience, as if their love had been just another asset on his balance sheet. In the days that followed, Nicholas offered her options: cold, transactional, a revised prenup, a silent separation, full access to resources if she kept up appearances. Think of your image, Julia. Think of Emily. But Julia couldn't. She couldn't lie anymore. Not to herself, and not to her daughter. One night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Julia stood at the edge of her daughter's bed, watching her breathe. A wave of guilt and panic washed over her. How could she raise her child in a world where truth didn't matter? She packed a small suitcase. Nothing from the closet Nicholas curated for her, just her own clothes, a few notebooks, and Emily's favorite bedtime book. The next morning, without press, without headlines, Julia left. She didn't ask for a dime. She didn't call her publicist. She didn't even tell her closest friends. She disappeared, not because she was ashamed, but because staying meant raising her daughter inside a house built on power, fear, and illusion. And Julia had made her choice. The first night alone with Emily was the hardest. They stayed in a modest rental 2 towns over, far from paparazzi, far from anything familiar. The silence was thick, not peaceful like before, but full of absence. Julia sat on the edge of the bed, watching her daughter sleep, listening to the radiator groan in the corner. There were no staff now, No private chefs, no schedule, only them. Emily asked questions, of course. Where's Daddy? Are we going back home? Julia answered gently, choosing her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. We're starting a new adventure, she'd say. Just us girls. Emily believed her. For a while. The next few years passed like walking through water. Heavy, slow. Every day brought new challenges Julia had never faced before. Bills, grocery lists, public schools, judgmental stares from people who recognized her at the checkout line and whispered, "Isn't that Julia Bennett?" Work dried up quickly. Nicholas made sure of that. Quiet phone calls behind closed doors, gentle warnings to producers. She became difficult, unreliable, emotionally unstable. Hollywood had no room for nuance, no patience for women who walked away. She took jobs under pseudonyms, theater coaching, voice work, small parts in local productions. Enough to pay rent, not enough to recover. More than the financial strain, it was the emotional weight that wore her down, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the memories that surfaced at night uninvited. She missed parts of Nicholas, or maybe she missed who she thought he was. But even more, she mourned the woman she used to be. Confident, luminous, needed. Emily grew quieter with each passing year. She stopped drawing those family pictures. She stopped asking about their old house. At 13, she told Julia, "I don't remember what his voice sounds like." Julia nodded, hiding the guilt that still lived deep in her chest. She tried to give Emily normalcy, birthday parties, bedtime routines, long walks in the park. But there was always something in her daughter's eyes, a distance, a waiting, as if she knew something had been taken but wasn't sure what. There were moments of light, though. Shared laughter over burnt pancakes, old movies on rainy afternoons, the time Emily got the lead role in the school play and Julia cried from the back row. Pieces of happiness stitched together from broken fabric. But Julia could feel it. The weight of the untold story between them. Emily never said it, but Julia knew. Her daughter blamed her, not for leaving, but for never explaining why. And so the silence lived between them, year after year, like a third presence in their home. No longer Nicholas, but not quite gone either. Julia kept the truth buried, not because she couldn't tell it, but because she didn't know how. Until now. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It had no return address, just her name written in firm, clean strokes. Julia Bennett. Inside was a formal invitation to a private tribute gala in Los Angeles, honoring Nicholas Carter, who had passed away 2 months earlier. The letter explained the event would be intimate, by invitation only. Family, close friends, and former partners. Julia stared at it for a long time. She hadn't cried when she heard about Nicholas's death. There was no relief, no sadness, just a strange emptiness. Like someone had finally removed a painting that had been hanging crooked for years. And now here was this, a chance to step back into that world, the world she'd run from. She thought of throwing the letter away. Instead, she kept it in a drawer. Days passed. Emily noticed her mother was distracted, quieter than usual. And one evening, while they were cleaning the attic, Emily found something. An old photo. Julia, young, radiant. Nicholas beside her, arm tight around her waist. And Emily, a baby, bundled in white. The family they used to be, captured in still life. "Why don't we ever talk about him?" Emily asked. She wasn't accusatory, just tired of the silence. Julia sat down, the dust swirling around them like ghosts. Her hands trembled. She realized in that moment that her daughter had grown into a woman without knowing why her family had shattered, and that wasn't fair. That night, Julia didn't sleep. Instead, she pulled out journals she hadn't touched in years. Letters never sent, photos never framed, pieces of a past too heavy to carry but too painful to ignore. She stayed up writing, trying to find the right words. She didn't want to paint Nicholas as a villain, but she couldn't lie either. By morning, she had made a decision. "I'm going to the tribute," she told Emily at breakfast, "but only if you come with me." Emily blinked, surprised. "Why?" "Because it's time," Julia said. "You deserve to know everything." And so they booked the flights. Quietly, no press, no announcements, just two women returning to the city that made and unmade them. On the plane, Julia held Emily's hand. Not because she needed support, but because for the first time in decades, she was walking toward the truth, not away from it. It wasn't about redemption or revenge. It was about claiming the part of her life she had sealed away out of fear. She had protected Emily from the ugliness, but now Emily was grown, strong. She didn't need protecting. She needed honesty. As they landed in Los Angeles, the skyline shimmered beneath them. The same city, yet not the same woman. Julia no longer needed to hide. She was ready to speak. Los Angeles hadn't changed much. The palm trees still lined the boulevards like soldiers. Billboards still screamed new stars, new scandals, new promises. But to Julia, everything looked smaller. They arrived a day early and stayed in a modest hotel just outside the city. Nothing extravagant, nothing that whispered celebrity. Emily insisted on taking her mother to a small diner she found online. "Best pancakes on the West Coast," she claimed. Julia laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. Over coffee and syrup-stained menus, they spoke like women who'd finally run out of ways to avoid each other. Emily asked hard questions. Julia didn't flinch. She talked about the days when Nicholas's empire started to feel like a prison, about the silence she endured in exchange for safety, about how she chose to leave, not just for Emily, but because of her. They talked until the waitress started wiping tables twice just to stay nearby. That night, back at the hotel, Julia pulled out a shoebox, one she had carried across states, years, and regrets. Inside were fragments, a hospital bracelet from Emily's birth, a page from a forgotten script, a letter Nicholas had once written during their first year of marriage, so sweet it felt like fiction now. She handed the box to Emily. No speech, no build-up. "Take your time," she said. Emily sat with those items well into the night, cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through the remains of a life she'd only ever heard about in fragments. She cried, not out of grief, but because something that had once been vague and shadowed was finally solid, real. The next day was the gala. The venue was a glass-paneled estate overlooking the ocean. Guests wore black. Words like legacy and visionary echoed through the air. Julia entered quietly, Emily at her side. Heads turned. Whispers began. "Is that? She hasn't been seen in years." Julia held her head high. She didn't hide. She didn't shrink. She didn't pretend. When it came time for tributes, one by one, former colleagues and friends praised Nicholas's ambition, his brilliance. No one mentioned what it cost. And then, unexpectedly, the host called her name. "Julia Bennett, would you like to say a few words?" A pause. Julia rose slowly. She walked to the microphone, not as the actress they remembered, but as the woman she had fought to become. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "I knew Nicholas longer than most here," she began, "and more intimately than many. He was complex, generous in public, fierce in private. There were beautiful moments, and there were painful ones. I left this world a long time ago, not because I stopped caring, but because I had to choose between surviving it or surviving myself." A hush fell. Julia looked at Emily, who gave a small nod, quiet, proud, and in that moment, time folded. The girl Julia used to be, the woman she became, and the daughter she had fought to protect, all standing in the same room. Life had continued, and now so had she. The tribute was over. People lingered, offering polite condolences and carefully measured praise. Julia moved through the crowd like a ghost, acknowledged but not touched. But just as she and Emily were heading toward the exit, a man approached them, Charles Whitman, Nicholas's former attorney. Older now, slower, but still with that same calculating stare. He greeted Julia with forced warmth, then turned to Emily with a tight smile. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. Then turning back to Julia, his tone changed. "There's something you should know, something Nicholas never told you." Julia stiffened. Charles gestured to a side room away from the crowd. For a moment, Julia hesitated. Emily touched her arm gently. "You don't have to go," she whispered. But Julia nodded. "I need to." Inside the quiet study, Charles closed the door and opened a small leather folder. "Before he passed," he said, "Nicholas amended his will. He left something for you, not money, something else." He handed her a document. Julia's hands trembled as she read it. A letter from Nicholas, handwritten. She sank into the chair as she unfolded it. "Julia, I imagine you'll read this with skepticism, maybe even anger. You have every right. I never gave you the truth while I was alive, only control. I mistook love for ownership. I thought silence kept the world in order, but it broke you, and I see now it broke me too. You were never weak. You were the bravest person I knew. When you left, I told myself I hated you. But what I hated was that you had the strength to do what I never could, walk away from the illusion. I wanted to reach out 100 times, but I knew you wouldn't believe anything that came from my mouth. So here it is, on paper. I'm sorry, not just for the betrayal, for all of it, the control, the distance, the legacy I tried to preserve by destroying the life we had. If Emily is reading this too, I hope she knows her mother is the reason she had a chance to grow up free." Julia stopped reading. Her throat tightened. She closed the letter slowly, setting it down with care, like it might dissolve if she touched it again. She wasn't sure if it was closure or justice or just another ghost, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that for once, the truth didn't arrive too late. It had come while her daughter was still beside her, while her voice still had strength. She left the room, walked back into the light of the reception, and found Emily waiting by the window. Julia said nothing. She didn't need to. Emily stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her mother, holding her tight. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't forgetting. It was something harder and stronger. It was understanding. They didn't stay for the rest of the evening. Back at the hotel, the city lights shimmered outside the window, but Julia didn't look at them. She sat beside Emily on the bed, the letter still folded in her hands. Not clenched, just held. Like something fragile that had finally been passed down. Emily broke the silence first. "Do you feel better now?" Julia thought about it. "I don't know if better is the word," she said softly, "but I feel clearer." They sat in that quiet clarity for a long time. There are wounds that time alone can't close, wounds that need truth, and some truths only arrive when we're finally ready to hear them. Not before. Julia had once believed silence was a form of strength, that protecting her daughter meant hiding the ugliness of what she had endured. But what she learned, what life had forced her to understand, was that silence can also be a weight passed from one generation to the next. And now, finally, that weight had been lifted. Emily didn't ask for more details. She didn't demand the whole truth in a single sitting. She simply said, "Thank you for telling me, even now." Julia smiled through the tears. "I should have told you sooner." "But you told me now," Emily replied. "That's what matters." That night, Julia wrote in her journal for the first time in years. She wrote not about Nicholas or the betrayal, or the years lost to survival, but about her daughter. The girl who had once drawn crayon families, and the woman who now stood beside her in truth. She wrote about the power of choosing to live honestly, even when it's messy, about how healing doesn't always come with grand gestures, but sometimes with a quiet hand reaching across a table, and about how the past, no matter how painful, doesn't have to define the future. In the morning, they had breakfast on the balcony. The sky was clear, the air still. Julia watched as Emily laughed at something on her phone, the kind of soft, unburdened laughter she hadn't heard since childhood, and Julia realized they had made it, not to perfection, not to some picture-perfect ending, but to truth. And truth, even if it comes late, is still freedom. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button below. Let us know what you think about Julia's journey and if you think she made the right decision by confronting the past. Would you have handled it differently? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story like this.